Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Delighted to be hosting today our guests who are here from Canada. We have Bhai Maninder Singh, who is the spokesperson for BC Gurdwara, and we have Bhai Prabjot Singh, who is the lead counsel for the Coalition of Sikh Community, and he will be addressing and questioning Justin Trudeau this week. We also have guests from Australia. It's really important in the West Midlands, a seat where I represent a huge amount of Sikhs. What we are hearing from many within the diaspora community, not just Sikhs but more broadly, is around transnational and repression and what that actually means and how it plays out. And there are different examples that the Sikh community, certainly in West Midlands, have presented to the police. And of course, many MPs will be writing to the Home Secretary regarding the nature of what that looks like. But of course, a lot of this has come to head because of what we saw happen in Canada and of course the indictment in the United States. And so I'm really delighted, Baji, to welcome you here. It's important that parliamentarians hear about transnational repression, no matter which state or where it happens from, and what that actually means for people living here peacefully in the United Kingdom.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So I'm going to try to provide a little bit of a base to understand what political interference looks like, particularly in Canada, and provide some context, and allow Maninder Singh to speak in more in detail about transnational repression. Both of these things are completely intertwined, and it's very difficult to separate the two because of their objectives and what the entity that's perpetrating this is trying to do. So I think at the outset, it's important to understand that Indian foreign interference and transnational repression have been happening around the world for the past 4 decades. This isn't a new issue. It's something that's come to the forefront for a number of different reasons, which is the incidents that we're referring to, the Shahadat of Bhai Hardeep Singh, the assassination attempt on Bhai Gurpatwant Singh, the Shahadat of Bhai Avtar Singh Khanda here in the UK, other incidents that have been happening, Australia, Germany, other places all around the world. So when we're looking at India's transnational repression, like I said, over the last 4 decades, it's been something that's been really particularly focused on monitoring, intimidating, and coercing Sikh political dissidents all around the world. In the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years, given the changing geopolitical dynamic we have in the world today, India's foreign policy and these activities have taken an overtly aggressive tone. So I think understand that the underlying factors, there's a couple of them, but there's this sense that India's foreign policy is guided by this principle or this aspiration that India is a Vishav Guru. And so this idea comes out of a sense of arrogance, but it's also part of this cultural supremacy of the BJP's Hindutva agenda. That India is going to place itself in a position in global politics where it is a superpower and it will dictate and teach others in this entire system. So when we're looking at foreign interference and we're looking at transnational repression, we're looking at 2 intertwined objectives. So the first is influencing global powers and partners to align themselves with India's strategic interests. We've seen a number of controversies around India's position on the invasion of Ukraine, other conflicts in the world, its proposed leadership over the global south. You're seeing India's foreign interference overtly taking forms within the EU, within UK, Canada, UK, US, Australia, to persuade these countries to take a softer position against India on these kinds of issues. And more importantly, you're seeing India cracking down on political dissidents and critics of the government, given its own domestic fragility, but also because it needs to get rid of dissident and critical voices that are going to ensure that what the reality of what India and the Hindutva project aren't heard in other political capitals all around the world. So it's important to understand that the foreign interference and transnational repression we're seeing are also not just symptoms of the geopolitical instability we're seeing, but it's an inherent part of the Hindu nationalist imagination. So when we look at around the world, I won't go too much into the examples because we want to have a little bit of back and forth as well. But in Germany in the past 5 to 7 years, and we've recorded this in some of our reports, there's been prosecutions of at least 4 to 5 different individuals for working for India's intelligence agencies, monitoring Sikh dissidents, influencing media, as well as passing sensitive information of family members of activists back to India. In Australia, we've seen a number of incidents of disinformation. We've seen diplomatic pressure alongside foreign interference and disinformation to polarize communities, manufacture narratives of sectarianism, as well as trying to apply pressure on the government to crack down on Sikh activists. With the UK, by Devinderjit Singh, we'll talk in more detail. In the US, we've seen incidents, obviously the attempted assassination. And in Canada, given the Foreign Interference Commission that's been ongoing since January of this year, we've had the opportunity in Canada to actually bring a lot of previously classified information and documents onto the record. So we're talking about ministerial governmental correspondence, and we're talking about classified top secret intelligence documents that have now been presented onto the public record because of our advocacy at the Commission. So that Commission, its scope is essentially, it's focused on electoral interference in 2019 and 2021, and is now, this second phase is looking at Canada's ability to detect, deter, and counter foreign interference. So naturally, there's this opportunity where there's a more wholesome conversation about what are all the different types of foreign interference activities that are happening in Canada that are being perpetrated by India. So as a result of the classified documents we've seen, Canada's, what I'm going to kind of focus my comments on is now Canada's observations and assessments of what India is doing and engaging in terms of their objectives and their tactics. So the first thing is that it's clearly trying to amplify a pro-India sentiment and narrative that's going to support India's global interests and policy positions. And so some of these controversial issues that we've kind of talked about. It's also to actually target entire governments, countries, political parties, and political leaders that aren't towing a specific line. So we can get into this more in the Q&A if you'd like, but we're talking about specific targeted misinformation against the Prime Minister, the leaders of different political parties, interference in elections at every single level of government and at every type of election, from nominations of candidates for each party, to the general election, to the leadership races of the different political parties. So we're talking about a very serious concerted effort on India's part to really find its way in to every sphere and channel of policy making and decision making in Canada. And lastly, I think the most one of the most sensitive and the immediate threats that we see is that India is using its diplomatic efforts alongside interference, particularly to criminalize Sikh political advocacy for Khalistan, for human rights, or any criticism of India. So it's actually pressuring countries, including the US, UK, Canada, Australia, to actually criminally prosecute individuals who are exercising constitutionally protected rights in all of these countries in advocating for human rights or political sovereignty. So I want to touch on a couple of documents. So in March 2024, Csis provided a high-level top-secret briefing to the deputy ministers of a number of different ministries. And in their statement and their assessment is that India is the second most active threat perpetrating foreign interference in Canada, with the objective of covertly influencing Canadian officials at all levels of government to take decisions and positions that are favorable to the government of India. And specifically kind of picking up on the pro-Hindutva agenda of the current government, Csis says that the Hindu-centric government of India gears Canadian policy and messaging towards India's interests, which includes countering the influence of Sikhs in Canadian politics. So we're not talking about just political dissidents at this point and kind of what their objective is. We're talking about countering the influence of an entire community of people in public life altogether. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to talk too much about transnational repression. By Maninder Singh will talk about that in more detail. When we're looking at elections, India is using proxy groups and individual proxies to actually engage in this, the interference that we're talking about at the electoral level. So we're talking about coordinating, pressuring, coercing diaspora groups that they're able to wield their influence over. So whether that's individuals who need visas or other political favors from the government of India, is coordinating those groups to support certain political candidates that align with India's agenda. It also means using proxy organizations to actually attack and undermine those individuals and those politicians who are deemed to be or perceived to be anti-India. And recently, this past year, we haven't seen specific details because they're classified and Csis isn't releasing exactly the mechanism of how this happened. But there's actually monitored, documented examples of India actually providing illicit funding to specific campaigns directly from India through the use of proxies. And the most I think, pervasive and difficult to pin down, but potentially one of the most dangerous forms of the foreign interference is disinformation. And we've seen that issue all around the world. The UK, the US, Canada, the EU, Australia, all of these countries are struggling with how do we address disinformation, how do we track it, how do we identify it, how do we counter it. India and with the global affairs last week, before the Commission talked in quite some detail about India's massive potential and capacity to engage in disinformation because of the size of their media ecosystem. And essentially, we've seen some evidence about the establishment of this international network of mirror media agencies that will kind of echo each other and amplify the narratives that will find their way to seep into the Canadian media ecosystem as well. So in terms of the messaging or the impacts, I think first and foremost, one of the most concerning lines of disinformation and impacts of disinformation we're seeing is that it's explicitly and implicitly aimed at polarizing communities and imposing a sectarian narrative, which obviously has corrosive impacts on communities and social cohesion, which is another thing that was explicitly acknowledged by Csis during the hearings. So we're talking about manufacturing sectarian conflict in Canada where it doesn't exist. So where there's political disagreement, where there's criticism of India, it is kind of shadowed or kind of shown to be sectarian conflict between Sikhs and Hindus and amplifying this engineered narrative of Hinduphobia. The other piece that we're seeing is we're seeing these narratives are actually trying to criminalize and demonize a racialized minority. As Sikhs, we're a very highly visible minority with our dastars, with our Csis, and India is actually manufacturing narratives of extremism and of terrorism that the RCMP, Global Affairs have all gone on the record at the Commission that advocating for political sovereignty for Khalistan or human rights is not extremism, according to Canada's definition, or in any country that has kind of liberal freedoms of expression and those kinds of things. But we're seeing pressure from India to actually demonize these communities as inherently extremist, and we're seeing that link to rising cases of anti-Sikh hate and the increase of hate crimes and violent attacks on Sikhs as a result that are correlated with this amplification of disinformation. And lastly, we've seen a targeting of the federal government and leaders themselves since 2018, which is including specific orchestrated disinformation campaigns at the Prime Minister, the Government of Canada, essentially to discredit the government, to force them to align their policy with India's interests. And one of the most concerning pieces that came out is from a Csis brief from September 2023, which is heavily redacted. But that document goes into considerable detail about India's aspirations to increase its cyber capabilities and essentially purchase technology and training from other countries to engage in cognitive warfare. So when we're looking at cognitive warfare, we're talking about a new kind of horizon of disinformation that integrates traditional psychological operations and misinformation campaigns with advances in neuroscience, cognitive technology and computer technology to change decision-making, behaviors, and outlooks of complete communities. And in Csis' assessment, they've concluded that India is going to be targeting Canada with cognitive warfare to manufacture and amplify pro-India and anti-Sikh, anti-Khalistan narratives in the country. So I think this is an incredibly alarming issue, obviously, and we've seen the impacts in Canada very specifically with the assassination of Bhai Hardeep Singh. But we've seen these kinds of entanglements and intertwinements all around the world where India is using its diplomatic influence to try and pressure other countries to criminalize Sikh activists, and is using foreign interference and disinformation to kind of twist their arms to make that happen. We've seen concerning examples of that in the UK as well, with the Home Secretary accrediting and authorizing an extradition request that actually didn't have any evidence, and it was thrown out by a British court at the first instance. We've seen examples of public statements from Indian security agencies in terms of their success in convincing UK agencies to surveil, harass, and raid homes of Sikh activists in the UK. We've seen similar examples in Canada. So I think when we talk about foreign interference and transnational repression, it's something that is definitely happening in Canada, but if we do not shed a light on it, if there's no transparency, public acknowledgement, and an explicit policy priority to counter it, we're looking at a very serious threat to the UK's own political and democratic institutions, as well as to the lives and security of Sikh activists and other political dissidents in this country as well. So I'll leave my comments there as well, and I'll pass it over to Maninder Singh.
For those that kind of came in afterwards, Prabhjot Singh is a spokesperson for the Sikh Coalition, which is made up of Sikh Gurdwaras and institutions across Canada, which is right now at the Foreign Interference Commission in Ottawa that's happening in Canada, and Prabhjot Singh is our lead counsel there. I represent the coalition that is working with Prabhjot from the BC, British Columbia side, and also the Ontario side as well. So from east to west coast. So the purpose of us kind of coming today and sharing the information that we have, we do want to kind of put a caveat in there that all the information we're sharing is information that is on public record within Canada. It's coming out of the Commission. It is information that was redacted for decades that has now been kind of like opened up for the public in Canada to see what's actually been happening. From that, we've seen countries like India, China, Russia, others that have been implicated in foreign interference, not only within the Sikh community, but in the democratic institutions of Canada itself, which includes its electoral system, and as Prabhjot Singh has already mentioned, right from the nomination of a candidate right through to the party leaderships of various political parties, interference is at every level, and it's done by several different countries. Our interest in particular is India, and there are several reasons why, but probably the primary one is that India is the only state actor within Canada, or potentially, but definitely within Canada, that is known now to have killed a Sikh leader, Canadian citizen, on Canadian soil. And it is considered by Canadian intelligence agencies, as per the Foreign Interference Commission, to be in the top two, maybe just behind China when it comes to foreign interference that's happening in Canada. So the interference is real. The implications of it is what I want to speak about. You've heard some of the things from Prabhjot Singh. I will start off by saying I was a very close friend of Mr. Nijjar, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who was assassinated. And I got to see that up close and personal as to how that affected not only him, the Sikh community, but also then afterwards with the September 2023 announcement by Prime Minister Trudeau that India had a hand in this assassination and carrying it out, what that implication had for the greater Canadian society, as well as the sovereignty of the entire nation was being undermined. I will kind of start off by saying that we have several Sikhs in Canada that have duty to warns against them, and duty to warns are provided by INSET, which is the Integrated National Security Enforcement Team. INSET deals primarily with foreign threats to Canadian citizens. I myself have received 3 different duty to warns, one in July of 2022, along with Mr. Nijjar, then shortly after his assassination, and then again earlier this year as well. That I would kind of put a caveat in there that many people right now, I think, have moved on from the situation to think that, well, India might have killed this guy, but they definitely did. And they probably won't act in this type of way or manner again. But if you look just 48 hours ago, the Foreign Affairs Minister for Canada, Melanie Joly, made a statement publicly stating that Canada is still fearful of further assassination of Sikhs in Canada. So this is not over by any means, and the reality of it to people like myself, to other Sikh leaders across diaspora communities, including Canada, US, and the UK, is a very real situation that is still unfolding, and by no means should it be seen as complete at this time. I want to just focus on a few things that Prabhjot has spoken about, but more in what the reality of that repression looks like. You have people here that are facing that repression as well within this country. We have it in Australia and other diaspora communities as well. And I'd like to just start off by, in July of 2022, a Sikh in Canada, Rupadaman Singh Malik, was murdered on July 15th. I just want to give you an idea of a timeline so it helps kind of paint a picture as to how quickly this unfolded right before us. Within 3 days, Sikh organizations across Canada felt that this was India, that India had assassinated this individual, potentially. We wanted them to look into it at a minimum. Within 1 day of sending that letter, 5 duty to warns were provided to 5 different Sikh leaders and activists across the country, myself included. We were removed from our homes. We were provided no support by the government. We were basically told that our lives are at risk and to figure it out. I have 2 children at home. I was not allowed to stay at home. I was removed from my home for 2 months, or my children were going to be taken away by Children and Family Services. So the reality of the situation on citizens that live in these countries is very, very real, and it's only getting worse, what we see on the Canadian scene. These things happen, and we don't care for any sympathy. That's not why I'm making this statement. I'm speaking more to the reality of it, of how this unfolds. Within days, we were given these duty to warns. From July of 2022 till June of 2023, the Canadian government provided Mr. Nijjar with basically monthly warnings that his life was in danger. He received no support in any which way. All he was told was over and over again that he should potentially stay at home, get out of public life, stop his activism, stop speaking out. And as we live in these countries, I don't think anyone thinks that's a way that we could live our lives, that we live in these countries to make sure that people can speak out, that there is a freedom of expression. Many people that fled countries from now till 1,000 years before us all came into other countries to see if they could make a better life for themselves. And I think it's no different in the way what Mr. Nijjar was doing, speaking out on behalf of his community, the human rights violations, the pursuit of sovereignty. So that wasn't an option. So Mr. Nijjar continued his activities until June 18th, 2023, Father's Day of 2023, where he was gunned down in one of the busiest gurdwaras in North America in front of our men, women, and children. And that kind of, when we look at that from June of 2023, from his assassination up until the present day, we've had well over half a dozen Sikhs that have received duty to warns across the country. In my case, several of them. We've also seen that in September and November of 2023, with Prime Minister Trudeau's revelations around India's involvement, and in November, the US indictment that was opened up on the plot to assassinate Mr. Gurpatwant Singh Pannu, that there was a real, tangible, evidence-based case that was being built against India, that they were engaging in this foreign interference. And I've mentioned what Melanie Joly has said, and just as of today, if some people are kind of following as of what's happening right now between India and Canada, just a short while ago, India has pulled their envoy from Canada because Canada has provided a diplomatic note to India stating that the Indian High Commissioner, the ambassador to Canada, is being implicated in potentially the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, along with other Indian diplomats. India's Ministry of External Affairs has released a statement as of this morning denying those charges, saying that Canada is actually interfering in India, which is absolutely ludicrous, but is commonly the stand they take in these situations. Commonly as in what we've seen from them in the past. And now, just within the hour, news breaking in Canada that India's envoy is being pulled. The diplomatic row and the relationships between these countries is at stake. And it's at stake because of India's violent tendency to quash any form of legitimate dissent, is from what we've seen. So I think the way this is unfolding is that it's started in Canada. We've seen it in the United States. We know the repression and the interference is happening in countries like the UK and Australia as well. So I think it's only a matter of time where it rears that ugly head, unfortunately, within the UK as well. And one of the only reasons why it hasn't been so public here is that once it moves to a public inquiry like it did in Canada, it opens up in a way where the media there, the public there, political parties are on edge. No one knows how deeply India has infiltrated, or some of these other foreign actors have infiltrated into government, into democratic institutions, electoral processes. into Canadian life and into Canadian media and academia as well. There is no limit on the interference that's happening. I have just one other area that I want to quickly cover off. And I think this is a very important piece to kind of point out because it involves intelligence agencies within Canada and what's happened in this situation. In the national, one of the national parliamentarian teams that we have for national security, a report was opened up during the Foreign Interference Commission that we're seeing now, that Csis was planning to move against the nexus of Indian spies and agents and those that were engaging in foreign interference as far back as 2016 and 2017 in Canada. This included multiple individuals, including the Indian Consul General in Vancouver at the time, Mr. Amarjeet, and another individual that was acting as an intelligence agent under diplomatic guise, Barak Jan. These individuals within the report are named, which is a public document. And in this, what we're seeing is there's a political sensitivity that Canada showed in not acting. And that was actually provided in the Foreign Interference Commission in Canada, meaning that when these reports from Csis were provided to Canadian parliamentarians, including the Prime Minister's office and others, the response they received, according to the document, is that no action would be taken until the Prime Minister's visit to India in 2018 was not completed. On the return of that trip, which was an absolute failure in many ways on the Canadian side, the Prime Minister had signed security documents with India, sharing security and information details about Sikhs in Canada in particular. There was information sharing agreements that were shared. These things then led to increased surveillance against Sikhs in Canada. It led to Sikhs in Canada being kind of not only surveilled online, but in person, bank accounts being frozen, people being put on no-fly lists. And years later, a lot of that stuff being reversed, but extreme damage being done within the Sikh community. It led to reports being produced against the Sikh community, which were then redacted and removed, which named the Sikh community in and of itself, not a section of it, but in and of itself, the entire Sikh community in Canada as an extremist threat to Canada's security in December of 2018. And after 6 months of lobbying, the mention of Sikh was completely removed, which begs the question as to why it was there in the first place, if there was adequate intelligence to do so. And this is an annual report provided by the Public Safety Ministry of Canada. And later on, we will learn that India's pressure, the diplomatic ties, the relations, the economic ties, all of that had a factor in what was happening there. So nothing happened in 2018. If anything, surveillance on the Sikhs actually continued. And this method was used from about 2018 all the way till Hardeep Singh's assassination in 2023, where we've seen a significant change in the way Canada is dealing with India. And mostly that has to do with the fact that Canada's sovereignty was undermined in the most extreme way possible with the murder of a Sikh leader and Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. And for that reason, we are working closely with the government, challenging what happened leading up to the assassination, because that could never happen again, not only for the Sikh community, but for any citizen that is in Canada. That should never be the case, that a foreign government comes onto foreign territory and assassinates people. Finally, just in conclusion here, for us, foreign interference is not just about the manipulation of democratic institutions and elections. For the Sikh community, foreign interference and transnational repression is a life or death situation now. And I can say that to you because it is for me, and it is for the people sitting to the right of me, potentially to the left of me. And it's a broader issue that's within the Sikh community now. It is not just about documents and intelligence, it's about people's lives. And we don't want to see that happen anywhere else. So, we are, just like we claim the claim that we have, that we work for the welfare of all in Sarvatapala, that this is an opportunity for us to present at least some information about what's coming out of Canada, much of which we expect that you're already being briefed on and watching very closely yourselves. So we're not here to, I think, teach you anything that you're not already well aware of, but we did want to take the opportunity to speak to certain facts and things that are unfolding in real time within Canada. And for us, the sovereignty of other countries is what's at risk. The assassination of citizens in those countries is a huge risk. and the undermining of democratic institutions that make up these countries is definitely at risk. So I think this is imperative right now that we take a closer look at what's happening in that, especially for us, the Sikh diaspora communities like the UK, where these things are very real. They're unfolding before us in real time, and the political will to actually act against India is something that we would urge you to consider and take back to your respective political parties and continue those discussions so a similar type scenario doesn't unfold on this soil in the UK as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open up just for reflections, reactions, and any questions to Prime Minister Singh, Mandeep.
Just to point out, I think the surprising thing for me is that going back to 2016-17, for me, is just the tip of the iceberg. You could go back to literally post-Sikh genocide in India, and the actions that India's taken in respect to Canada, and the things that have been pinned on our community, which, again, are probably not as sophisticated as things would be now given the advent of technology, but to criminalise our community to the extent that they have. You only have to look at the Sacrificing Sikhs report to see the actions that are taking place in this country. You only have to look at Australia and what's going on right now. Literally this gangland kind of pasting of walls of slogans, throwing it onto our community. The community doesn't really do too much to, upset, really. All we're really asking for is our rights that we were supposedly supposed to have post-47, and where those haven't been granted, to pursue an alternate path. And in that time, the number of issues that are going on in respect of health, the things that we face, Nijjar being a primary issue, I still don't understand how this country, our country, Britain, thinks it's reasonable that one of their citizens sits there for over 7 years in a jail without any real charge, and no one really seems to make any representations about it, which is what concerns me more than anything else. This is a guy he's my age, and I've done a lot of things since I was 13, I'm now 37. What has this guy missed out on? His percentage of his adult life which has been cut short because of apparent bureaucracy or an unwillingness to take the steps that were required. I mean, my criticisms are of the Tory party and probably to an extent Mr. Starmer who's in power now. It's one thing to talk about arbitrary detention out of leadership and then to kind of swerve that till now, I guess, and not take steps to make significant representations to India. And I think it feels like, certainly from a UK perspective, politically, we tiptoe around it for various reasons. But if we don't stand by principles, this will just carry on, and it's endless. And I applaud Canada for obviously taking the steps that it's taken. But again, it seems like we could go back 30 years before 2016, we could find interference there too. So are we still going to go down this process of having a process, but then it being half-baked really, in terms of its actual substance? Because the extent that this is going on, it will only go worse further. BBC did a great piece a few years ago about interconnection of media across the world. So the points you raise are completely correct, but what's being done about this? I mean, we're supposed to have a free press, but in this country, and certainly in Canada and the US, it's not really that free. So this seems to be a broader issue of a state actor, which is supposed to be friendly. It's a democracy and all of these other things. It seems just as bad as China or Russia, yet won't be called out for it. So, and obviously that's trade and relationships from that perspective, but there has to be principles and values at some point that we stand by. Otherwise, what do we have? Not much.
Can I just say before I bring you in, just to say that the last government did launch a consultation on transnational repression where it was seeking evidence from anybody that wanted to feed into that. This government is equally committed to human rights. Many of us do feed in concerns of our respective constituents. The problem with the last government, though, is you hollow out your expertise in the Foreign Office when you have such a unstable government where you're constantly changing ministers. You never really get a sense of and a grip of the evidence base in China for Russia and other state actors. And we know that there is interference, and certainly we see that electorally. But just to sort of push back on that, I think the government is taking it very seriously. What this is why we're hearing today the experience of Canada and what Trudeau's government has been doing and how it's built up the evidence base, working with the community. But clearly it's in a different situation than we are here in the United Kingdom at the moment.
I'll add on to that point. I'm specifically referencing their Air India flight and how that was pinned on our community. And your Secret Service exposed that for what it actually was. And the rest of the world doesn't really seem to look at that, but that's horrific what took place there. And I'm amazed that Csis hasn't gone back that far given what took place there. They know about it themselves. So
I think the political will, when I spoke at the end there, I do have to say that the political will of a country will dictate the response.
of course.
And I think you've touched on a lot there, and the focus of that political will for me has always been, we tried in Canada for years to bring that political will forward, our lobbying efforts, our meetings, and most of the time it would fall flat. And it was diplomatic ties, economic ties for our governments that would take precedent. And you can't say it in that way, but when there's inaction on any front in any country, that's usually the reason why, because they don't want to move and disturb what they have going on right now, and they're looking at what their priorities are. Now, people that are championing human rights and they're activists, they'll never go for that. And people like us will constantly keep going at it. When it comes to Jagdar Singh, like Joel, with Jaggi, I think it's imperative. As in, I think anywhere, we raise the issue in Canada, and he's not our citizen, and we just can't stop because it's that we just see ourselves in him now. That he went back there, he got married, he's picked up, and then everyone's like, okay, maybe they'll let him go. 7+ years later, we've got a guy that is still in jail, brutally tortured under remand, forced confessions. There's so much on the record there. And I will take it back to just political will. That I feel as in if there's a will to do something, a country can do it. So as in I'm not saying that as in I agree with any country and how they deal with some of these situations. We understand the politics of it, but we have a guy in jail, and as in we need him out. It is our final kind of position on that. So we will back you 100% all the time if that's the fight that's going on here, because tomorrow it'll be one of us, one of our citizens in Canada, a Sikh from Canada will be languishing in a prison in India, and then we'll be taking up the same fight again. The unfortunate reality, and I'll stop here with this point, the unfortunate reality for the Sikh community is that until we have sovereignty and we have a nation of our own and we have Khalistan, we are seen as potentially liabilities in many countries because India turns us into liabilities, as to what Prabhjot Singh was saying. The malignment of our community, the shown as extremist radicals, these types of terrorists that they've kind of painted us as. The unfortunate reality is that many governments have unfortunately just decided to define us that way. And then for us, when we show up, we're actually a problem for them, not necessarily somebody that's actually offering a solution. And that's a horrible position to be in when you're actually advocating for human rights, for your sovereignty, for your right to self-determination. And that's the position that India has put us in. Now, we're going to push back till the days we die that's not who we are. But at every step of the way, we have every right to sovereignty. We have every right to self-determination. We have every right to speak about Khalistan, our political prisoners, and human rights violations committed against us. Where we have to get other people to is to take the political will to actually act. As a country that defends or says they defend human rights and defend political expression, then those countries have to show that in action, not just word.
I just want to jump in on that really quick. In terms of the political will, I think it's very clear, and I think it's safe to say that one of the reasons India's activities have escalated so significantly is because they've been able to operate with impunity over the past few decades. But most importantly, in the past few years, given the strategic importance of India to the UK, US, Canada's, Australia's foreign policy is that India feels like it can get away with anything because these countries are giving it quite a bit of rope to do whatever it wants. So I think in terms of that political will, I think what happened in Canada last year is what happens when countries like this are given impunity and allow their countries to become playgrounds for Indian intelligence agencies and proxy groups that are engaging in this kind of interference. And so you spoke a lot about, I think, in terms of the morality of it, the ethics of it, and these countries should take a stand. And I would agree with you wholeheartedly, but I think pragmatically, for a country that has interests in the South Asian region, you cannot put your eggs in a basket that is as volatile and unstable as a country that's going to assassinate a citizen of a foreign country on that foreign country's soil. That's not a reliable partner or a reliable ally. The UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues in the past, I think about 2 years ago, actually did a report on India and said very clearly that if the rise of Hindutva, authoritarianism, assimilation, and centralization in that country is not checked, we're looking at potentially the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet in that country. So I think I agree with you, but I'll take it further. When we're talking about crafting foreign policy in these countries and how the UK, Canada, or the US or any other country should approach India, it really needs to look at the reality of what India is and how it conducts itself internationally and domestically.
Anybody else wanted to come in before I
Shall I just fire away? I think it's really good to hear from our Canadian colleagues that we're sitting in the UK Parliament and we've got MPs from Birmingham, Slough, Wolverhampton, Leicester, Gravesham, Dumbarton, and Ilford, and with Baroness Varsity sort of sandwiched in the middle. But actually, one of the things Prabhupada says is this goes back 40 years. This is nothing new. And we're talking about Canada. It's also 40 years since the attack on the Golden Temple and the direct involvement of the UK government. And that's why, particularly new MPs, we got copies of Sacrificing the Sikhs report, was what happened 40 years ago based upon government papers. Nothing we've written here, this is based on government papers that are out there. And obviously there is a call for a public inquiry around those events, and hopefully we'll get that, because the public inquiry in Canada was supposed to be about the Chinese and Russians to begin with. It was only in January 24 the Canadian side put India in there. But now we're finding, today Greg Miller was supposed to be from the Washington Post. He said, I'm not coming because have you seen the news that's just broken in Canada? What's going on in Canada as we speak, and I know Prabhupada will be questioning Justin Trudeau on Wednesday when he gives evidence, is political interference and transnational repression are like this. If you read what Freedom House have written about transnational repression and the role of governments, the way governments operate either encourages or discourages transnational repression. And I've looked through that checklist. The UK government of every political persuasion in the last 40 years has sold out Sikhs in this country. Sold us out 40 years ago. I know Douglas is Jaggi's MP, and he will know firsthand from his brother and his family. The very difficult situation is when you're in government to try and convince a so-called friendly government that you can't torture a British citizen. You can't get them to sign blank sheets of paper. You can't have them in arbitrary detention for 7 years. But it's another matter securing his release and return to be with his family. But I think these are real issues, and I'm very conscious of the time, but to make it real for UK politicians, when Avtar Singh Kunda was killed 3 days before Pradeep Singh Nijjar was shot dead, you will not believe the information that we hold. Michael Pollack couldn't be here, the barrister representing his family. You know, in those days, there were people approached in June 23 in Birmingham. There are people in Leicester, I can name constituents. There have been people with firearms outside people's homes in the UK. There are people from the UK, like Jaggi, in prison, British citizens, for protesting in London. This has happened in the last 18 months. But our politicians are largely silent because they need to be led by the government. And I think it goes back to what Canada, for its various reasons, Justin Trudeau made that bold step on the 18th of September 23 to call out India in Parliament. And yes, Canada's probably paid a heavy price in terms of its relationship today with literally the Indians removing effectively their ambassador from Canada. And if you read the Washington Post headlines today, you'll know why, because India's overreacted again. One of the things that hasn't been touched upon, and I will mention it, in November 23, this was when India was in denial. When the fourth person was arrested in Canada, the shooter in her deep signature case in Toronto, him and I think it was 3 or 4 others were planning to kill people like Maninder Singh at a wedding. They were in denial mode. We have nothing to do with this. Apparently, they now say India might be cooperating with the Canadian authorities, but they have removed further people from its intelligence agency. And Greg Miller, and I will give him a plug, they carried out a 2-month investigation. They named who CC1 was in the American plot. They named the head of RAW being responsible and removed on the 30th of June 23. And they've gone further to say the smoking gun goes right to the Prime Minister of India because he was in America when these plots and these killings were going on. And I think the UK establishment, if I could put it that way, the fact that the Chief Constable of the West Midlands, we were telling them that there were people in the West Midlands that were getting threats. They reported it to the police, with firearms outside their home. And there's a series of meetings. I think we've had 3 meetings. We'll come back to 4. There are things happening on the streets of the UK. And will it take, somebody being shot dead before our politicians and our government wakes up to the reality that people face? And I think it's only a matter of time, but we won't have the mysterious death of Thartik Kunda. You'll have people that have been killed on the streets of Britain.
Following on from what you just said, do you think in light of what's happened in Canada, it will be that overt? Or do you think it's likely to be much more manipulation of the political situation in the UK, rather than the kind of overt violence that we saw in Canada? Because in some ways, although India is in denial mode on this, but do you feel that what happened in Canada and Trudeau's response has, to some extent, made them think again?
Shall I start out by Nominans who have very strong views on this? I think the Five Eyes nations had access to that information about what was happening through a deep signature and the plot in America. And the UK apparently provided the intelligence from India to corroborate what happened in a deep signature. That was only reported in one newspaper. I think, yes, there's been a change in government here. There's likely to be a change of government in Canada. There probably will be a change of president in the US. My understanding from the US and its intelligence agencies, they have openly, we've had 2 meetings now, the FBI and CIA at very senior levels with members of the Sikh community there. They're absolutely clear that trust has broken down with India. So I think it will actually be far bigger politically with the Americans, with its allies, saying India's gone way too far. The sorts of things, if they start to kill or plot to kill people in the US, Canada, potentially the UK, sooner or later the governments have to say, all right, yeah, we've got trade deals and we have to have a relationship with India and we have all that. But how do you balance it off with your duty to protect your own citizens? Jaggi being a classic example. So I honestly believe, and Sikhs believe in that, the truth eventually prevails. And the truth is that a minority community is being targeted for all sorts of reasons. The farmers' protests, things that Narendra Modi has taken personally, that the diaspora Sikh community has stood up to him and supported him. And it's much bigger. And I know when the Canadian Foreign Minister first came, first meeting was with David Lammy, same Foreign Minister 48 hours ago, basically said there's going to be more killings in Canada. They haven't taken this seriously. I think it will require a collective effort by many governments to say, this is not on.
Two quick things which might be helpful. One, are you linked into SIS and MI5? Is the British Sikh community having those conversations? And secondly, the Salisbury public inquiry provides quite an interesting opportunity really in terms of foreign interference and killings on British soils, and that started this morning. And I just think that there are some interesting parallels that you could certainly learn from what's going on there and whether there's scope. I mean, there was a British citizen who was killed, and it's around her death that this inquiry has started. But there is scope for a much broader conversation about foreign interference, and and obviously, I mean, I don't doubt it, but if these threats are real, and there is some good information out there, then that could be a way in which you could start this conversation as well.
That's great.
And our Manchester's representative as well.
Thank you.
Krishna, on the comment on the question, I think from a community perspective and just from a Sikh leadership perspective in Canada, we could only say that you wouldn't want to find out the way we found out whether India is capable of. And that's the unfortunate reality in the situation, is that they're so volatile, unpredictable, in denial, that we are still under that consideration that they could do anything at any time. And when our foreign affairs minister says the same thing 48 hours ago, that they're still concerned that India will carry out further assassinations of Sikhs in Canada, I think the only answer we could give is absolutely yes, that they're not being covert as they used to be. We never thought it would happen in Canada. We did not think that somebody would come there and take somebody out there in the violent way that they did. And so I could only answer, and as in you definitely don't want to find out, and we don't want to find out, that whatever measures can be taken before then. The idea around sharing information in public inquiries, other support that politicians can give to actually ground better security measures, and then finally just the political will to check India, because I'm sure intelligence agencies here and certain political ministries here are aware of the interference, and then just having the will to actually check them now versus allowing it to continue into that overt type violence.
I just want to make a very, very quick comment about that. When I talked earlier about India's aggressive foreign policy and that arrogance with which they're carrying themselves, Trudeau's statement was made in September 2023 about India's involvement. In May 2024 of this year, when Narendra Modi was campaigning for their election that was happening, he made a very clear, overt, explicit statement on the campaign trail saying that today's India, the BJP's Hindutva India, does not send dossiers requesting information or cooperation from other countries. Today's India is going to send people to kill our enemies and enter their homes. So that's the country that we're talking about. So in terms of that ongoing threat and the countries we're dealing with, I think it's important to keep that in mind. Sorry, there was a comment.
Just want to ask very quickly. Presumably, Deep Singh Nijjar's killers were prosecuted?
It's ongoing.
Right. Okay.
They were arrested in May of this year, and one shortly after that. The prosecution is still underway.
So it hasn't come to any kind of exclusion of it. The question I wanted to ask was, have we been able to get any information on that from the prosecution as to what's been going on?
So the prosecution is still at very early stages. I don't even know if they've entered pleas yet. And so after that, the trial would actually start. And so the way I would imagine that the UK is very similar. When a criminal prosecution is ongoing, the government is not going to comment about the evidence. But what has been said and very carefully wordsmithed by the government is that they have credible and strong intelligence that India was involved. So when Canada's National Security Advisor met with her counterpart Ajit Doval in August of 2023, she communicated very clearly that we know that India was involved in an extrajudicial killing. So the intelligence that underlying this is absolutely there. It's not able to come out publicly until that prosecution is actually underway.
Warinder, just to answer your question, the Washington Post headline today basically says Canada ordered 6 diplomats to leave Canada because of their direct involvement, including its ambassador in Ottawa. I think without a prosecution, politically, they're sending a very clear message that actually it goes right to the top. And as I mentioned, Washington Post took it right to the head of the drawer. So I think there's no disputing that not only the case is in Canada, but the case in America is going to bring up all sorts of things. And the worry is that governments between them will reach deals. Yet that's always the worry, that the ordinary person will never get the truth because this goes on, unfortunately. And I think as a worldwide Sikh community, we're saying, we want the truth to be known. We are a minority community being targeted in different countries, including in India. And actually, when this happens in your back garden, you expect your politicians to stand up for you, your government to stand up for you, and we're not feeling that way in the UK at the moment. Canada probably feels slightly better because at least their Prime Minister's taking a stand and they're prosecuting. But actually, we still can't get the coroner to do anything, we can't get the police to do anything, and we're worried about those other 6 people on their hit list in the UK, in Leicester, in Wolverhampton, in Birmingham. That's what I'm saying. If one of them gets shot dead or something happens, we'll be coming to you saying, we told you so. We told our government. And I think that is the current concern, that perhaps we don't have that same gun culture as perhaps North America, but nonetheless, it's a massive worry.